Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to be doing something really fascinating. We are literally peeling back the incredibly dense layers of history, myth, and frankly, geopolitics in one of the most complex cities on Earth, Jerusalem. We're going to look closely at how ancient stones, religious traditions, and modern geopolitical tensions just collide every single day.
Now, to start us off, here's the core mystery of the modern pilgrim experience. Why do millions of people travel thousands of miles year after year to walk paths, touch stones, and visit shrines that archaeologists and historians often just can't verify actually existed in the first century? Like, what is actually pulling them there?
Okay, let's dive right into this. You see, people aren't just going on a typical vacation here. They come to connect the physical geography of the place to the religious texts they've been reading their entire lives. They really want to empathize with historical suffering, specifically walking in the footsteps of Jesus. A lot of folks are looking for a profound spiritual transformation or seeking repentance, and in the Catholic tradition, there's even the historical practice of earning indulgences, which is essentially getting spiritual credit for completing the pilgrimage. So the driving force here? It's deeply emotional and spiritual. It's not strictly about textbook history.
Which brings us to our first section, inventing the route and the reality of the Via Dolorosa. So, take a look at this number, 15, as in the 15th century. Now, you might assume the route pilgrims walk today was established way back in the 1st century, right after the events actually took place, right? Well, actually, the specific route we know today as the Via Dolorosa, with its specific stations, was developed in the 15th century. It was popularized by a pilgrim from Spain who wanted to bring the experience of the Holy Land back to Europe for people, like his own elderly grandmother, who simply couldn't make that long, dangerous journey. And this quote brilliantly hits the nail on the head. He commemorated what happened, not the exact geographic places where it happened. You see, the Stations of the Cross were initially designed as a portable spiritual exercise. They were set up on hills and in churches all across Europe. It was only much later that this European practice was imported back to Jerusalem, where specific events, like Jesus stumbling or meeting his mother, were assigned to specific, physical street corners in the Old City. Kinda wild, right?
Because this route is essentially a 15th century European creation, different Christian denominations interact with it in completely different ways today. Catholics generally walk the full route, stopping at all 14 established stations. Orthodox Christians, on the other hand, might walk the route, but they typically only stop to commemorate events that have a direct biblical reference, skipping traditions like Jesus falling, since that's not actually in the Gospels. And then meanwhile, many Protestant groups bypass this route and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre altogether. They often favor an entirely different site called the Garden Tomb, which was identified in the 19th century as an alternative setting that just looks a lot more like a 1st century garden.
Moving right along to Section 2, Archaeology versus Tradition, the Stones of the Trial. Now, there is a stark contrast here that we really need to talk about. At the 1st and 2nd stations of the cross, pilgrims truly believe they are standing on the exact spot of the 1st century trial of Jesus. But what's the archaeological reality? Well, that massive stone pavement known as the Lithostratos is actually part of a 2nd century Roman forum built by the Emperor Hadrian, nearly 100 years later.
The truth is, the actual Antonia Fortress was much smaller than the traditional route suggests. Archaeologists, starting way back with Charles Warren in the 19th century, discovered that directly beneath that impressive stone pavement lies the Struthion Pool. And in the 1st century, this was just an open moat. It didn't even have a stone covering. So the traditional story that the 1st century trial happened on those exact stones is, well, geographically and historically impossible.
So you have to wonder, does learning this archaeological truth break a pilgrim's faith? The answer is a resounding no. Tour guides use these physical stones simply as tools. They act as a spatial framework to help visitors connect to a narrative, to empathize, and to pray. The historical accuracy of a specific stone is totally secondary to the spiritual exercise it facilitates.
Let's transition over to Section 3, Layers of Ancient History, focusing on the Bethesda Pools.
The Bethesda Pools perfectly illustrate how physical sites in Jerusalem are just constantly evolving and changing hands over the centuries. It's literally like a giant historical puzzle. In the 1st century, this was a Herodian healing site with pagan temples. Skip to the 5th century, and Byzantine Christians identified it from biblical texts and built a massive church suspended on arches right over the pools. Then in the 12th century, the Crusaders arrived and built the absolutely magnificent Church of St. Anne. Next, the Ayyubids took over, and finally, believe it or not, the French Republic steps in during the 19th century.
So, the crucial point here is how these layers actually survive over time. The beautiful 12th century Crusader Church of St. Anne is one of the most perfectly preserved buildings in the Holy Land, but it only survived destruction because Saladin's forces repurposed the Christian building into a Muslim madrasa, which is a religious school. It's a profound historical irony when you think about it. A Christian monument saved by Islamic repurposing. It really highlights the deep interconnectedness of the city's religious history.
And how exactly did it become French? Well, international wars dictate local real estate. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, French and British forces backed the Ottoman Empire against Russia. As a token of gratitude for that military support, the Ottomans gifted the Bethesda site directly to France. And to this day, the site remains the official property of the French Republic, governed by French law, sitting right there in the middle of the old city.
All right, on to our final section, the fragile status quo and modern realities. To really understand this modern reality, you need to grasp a legal real estate concept known in Islamic law as waqf and in Jewish law as hekdesh. Basically, it means a property is legally designated as belonging directly to God. And because it belongs to God, it can never be sold, and its designated purpose can never be fundamentally changed. This is exactly why property disputes in Jerusalem are virtually unresolvable. You aren't just negotiating with a landlord, you are literally negotiating with the divine.
Let me give you a micro story that perfectly captures this madness. Back in 2019, the Greek Orthodox Church was renovating a monastery roof. This renovation accidentally caused 2 old Crusader-era stones to fall from a chapel wall inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Literally, just 2 stones.
But because of the status quo, fixing 2 little stones requires an international treaty. Here's the entirely true, albeit crazy, escalation. The city engineer closes the chapels for a full year because no one can agree on who actually has the right to put the stones back. Eventually, Israeli authorities approve a budget to fix these Crusader-era stones. But then the Egyptian Coptic monks who claim the chapel furiously protest Israeli involvement. This escalates to the point where Egypt's secular rulers are calling Israeli politicians. Eventually, the Israeli Antiquities Authority shows up to fix the stones, monks block the door, Israeli police are called in, and the whole thing ends in the violent arrest of a fasting Coptic monk. All of this absolute bureaucratic absurdity over 2 stones.
Now, the aftermath of this is where history collides with the modern internet. This incident happened right around the time of the George Floyd protests in the United States. Photos of an Israeli policeman kneeling on the back of this very thin Coptic monk went incredibly viral online. The amazingly complex geopolitical and historical context, a dispute over fixing 2 stones in a shared Crusader chapel, was just entirely erased. It was stripped of all its history and framed globally as a straightforward targeted violation of religious freedom, which, as we've seen, simply wasn't the reality of the bizarre bureaucratic nightmare that actually caused it.
It perfectly sums up the reality we're dealing with here. People don't really understand how complicated holy places can actually get. It is this delicate, chaotic balance of competing truths, ancient architecture, deeply held faith, and modern international politics, all squeezed into just a few square miles.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. Does the historical accuracy of a stone matter more than the centuries of faith that millions of people have poured into it? In Jerusalem, belief, myth, and history don't just coexist. They actively build upon one another, creating a reality that is far more powerful than simple historical facts. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning what's beneath your feet.